It makes 2 accounts.
It makes it so every time it makes 2 more.
It's a
like
hydra.
exponential.
It's a hydra of
Exactly.
splitters.
If you cut off one head.
Truly, we live in the brightest era. It's all coming out of this house. We're evolving. Or better yet, you have 2 wires that leads into 2 different drives, and you can choose to install Arch, or if you want to hurt them, you install like Parent. Or you run it out and you just straight install some vanilla if you want to.
I feel ashamed.
Me too. No way. That's okay. You gotta get this, put Arch on it, and then you use this as your boot drive.
That's I actually prefer this aspect ratio that I think you cannot understand why we want to put 6.
Yeah.
That's something nice. Why we want to put 6.
Yeah, I did ask that. And then not only that, but after we install Arch, we have to train them like that's harder than
And now it's different.
We're not too far. I'm trying to break their device.
It's low TensorFlow.
Low TensorFlow.
Yeah.
I tried my building.
Why?
Because for a second I thought they were actually using data science stuff. No, that's not. It's one function. It's just truncated normal distribution. No, and they're also just using it's a particularly difficult thing collection of things to a beautiful distribution. I just use the program just to be clear. No, the uniform one basically says choose each one. I guess just brand mod X. Yeah, that was that. I don't know. I don't do anything on the trust system.
So I think you
Have a model. That's how you I just don't want to.
I'm doing unlimited power.
Okay. So I sent the notes for today. Like I said, the class would be essentially 3 pieces, 3 parts. First, we will discuss any questions you have or any comments you have on the 2 papers you read on the temporal planning. I looked at some of the reviews that were posted. If there's any comments that you want to make, or if you have any questions that I can answer, we'll try that. And then actually there'll be a small interlude where Karthik will be presenting the stuff that I mentioned in the beginning of the class and it will be in the background about what do we mean by saying large language models cannot plan. So somebody wanted to take notes. You're going to take notes? Okay, good. Okay. Large language models cannot plan. And So then I will go to, after that, I go to the next big topic, may well be the last big topic, which is handling partial observability. And, obviously I can do POM-DPs, but I would focus actually first on the belief state planning, that is handling partial observability from the strips perspective, because it actually gives some kinds of insights that you should probably ask yourself why they aren't an issue when you do POM-DPs. So we may well do POM-DPs. If I had 8 or 9 more classes, I would have certainly done more things, but as it turns out, unfortunately, the end is near. Unfortunately, I don't know. Essentially, I think next week we have a Veterans Day, so there's no class. And then 11/18 we do have a class, and then 11/25 is again Thanksgiving. There's no class. Then 12/2 is the final class, and 12/5 is the final exam. Okay, so that's basically we have come to the sort of the ending parts. You have stuff to do, but the number of classes left are, obviously this the one serious class left is like 11/18 essentially. The other one will be the final class. And then of course that might be a good time to ask what would my grade be based on? I think you kind of know by now, but essentially I'm just going to say that you did do a bunch of things that I can base my grade on. The project type 1, type 2 that you're going to spend time on is going to be, again, I'm bringing this up. If you have any questions, you can ask, okay? And then the homeworks, basically the last of the homework has been given on temporal planning, and we have extra time for that. So, you should complete that too. The paper reviews that you have been writing, there will be a couple more, maybe at least one more, not a couple more, for the 18th. So, and typically you can tell who read the paper and who didn't based on what they wrote in the review and what they actually did in the review before the class. And then the class participation, which is, have you ever had a comment or a question like ever during the entire semester? I haven't heard, I don't know how people sound. Some of the people, they might have very high-pitched voice or very low-pitched voice. They never used it during the class. So I can't tell. So it's like a great mystery. So if such people, obviously they have made sure they didn't participate much. And then of course there would be an unexpected sanity test exam. And so unexpected means it will be happening at some point of time. And how many of you know unexpected hanging, the paradox of unexpected hanging? It's one of the greatest paradoxes still left in logic. So it goes like this. So there is this poor guy stuck in the prison, and he was going to be, he was supposed to be hanged, and then they come and tell him this week that sometime next week you would be hanged unexpectedly. And this guy, in addition to doing whatever the heck he did to get into the jail and to be, to be hanged, etc., also was a logician and mathematician, and he reasoned the following way, assuming that Saturday is the end of the week. He thought, if I wait until Friday and haven't yet been hanged, and when you're hung in the morning, basically, okay, then I have to be hung on Saturday, in which case it won't be a surprise. Right, because I know that it's Saturday, so it's not a surprise. So Saturday is out, right? Right. Now that you know that Saturday is out, by using mathematical induction, you can prove Friday is out. By the same way, Thursday is out, Wednesday is out, Tuesday is out, Monday is out, Sunday is out. So he has proved to himself that he cannot be hung, unexpectedly, and slept happily. And the next week, on a particular day, to his entire complete surprise, he was hung. Right? Actually, the philosophers are actually, you should look it up on the Wikipedia. There's a huge amount of literature on this. The philosophers are still not completely sure what is the actual fallacy in the unexpected hanging fallacy? So since I have an unexpected sanity test, you could do the same kind of reasoning, right? You know, that there are only so many places when I can hold that test and you can figure out exactly when it will happen. And then you can also prove to yourself that it can't happen. And then you too will be surprised. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
What is the test going to be
The course. So I'm just going to try to figure out, you know, basically people who got anything out versus nothing. I mean, so there should be a reasonable thing, right? I mean, my assumption is that people who sort of paid attention should be doing fine. People who came and slept basically thought, anyway, this is a seminar class, I don't have to do anything, would be surprised. Like, you asked me to figure out, I mean, you want more things for me to, you know, figure out how to give you a grade. So I have like so many bullets. You can't possibly say, on the rate my professor Rao gives grades without having any tests. So many tests. Yes. I mean, ignore all of them and still give a grade. That's a different story. But
Are we gonna have a nice run back from 471 where we just get given the monstrous final exam?
Well, yeah.
I would do it again. I would do it again. I would have a blast with it.
I don't know. Anything can happen. Okay. Yes.
So we'll have 2 exams.
What do you do?
One
Exactly?
is this and then there's the final exam period.
No, I mean, so I basically, if you read, it's called final exam period. So that's what it says. So that time belongs to me. So I don't know if you guys know this, but we have contact hours. And so you paid tuition so that we will have contact hours with you. And that contact hours includes the final exam period. And according to the ABOR, even if there is no final exam, I should come and contact you. So I'll make it clear, but you know, you should assume that 12/5 final exam period, I told you the time, you should keep that. Basically, you should be present.
But we don't know if there will be an exam.
My sense is that if you are thinking that I don't need to care about it, then you are in trouble. Otherwise, you should be fine. I'm not going to, obviously, I'm not going to, I have to be reasonable too. I mean, I'm not going to ask you things that you couldn't have possibly done that based on the level of discussion here. But, you know, I should still be able to tell the difference between people who have got something versus who got nothing. And it's only reasonable that everybody is not in the same basket. I don't even know what you guys do with these grades. You're grad students, but you know.
Kind of look at them and go, yeah, that's cool.
Anything else? Any other question? Okay, fine. So that's that. So yeah, there's no questions on this stuff, I guess, too. Okay, fine. So the first part is the questions about temporal planning papers. Okay.
I guess I was just curious.
Hmm.
So we talked a little bit in last class about required concurrency and how none of the competition sets had any required concurrency problems. So since then, has that?
Yes, they have changed that. They have changed that. Again, I think part of what I was trying to do is to tell you, as I think some of you have got on in your reviews, that it's very hard for, I mean, it's not obvious that community, just because there are multiple eyes. I mean, there's this beautiful point, right? That with enough eyeballs, every bug is shallow. You guys know who this guy, who said this? Eric Raymond, who who wrote this book on the temple and the bazaar, I think. About the whole public. Do people get anywhere with this? I mean, I think people stopped reading. They only prepare for the coding interviews. So, right? So it never used to happen this way in previous years, and when people do other things other than just coming to the classes. So if you're not coming to the classes, you're just preparing for the Python coding interview and nothing else. So that's why it's like even stuff like Eric Raymond's Temporal and Bazaar, not even a single acknowledgement that we heard about this. This guy wrote a book about Linux, essentially, and the whole open source thing. And then he pointed out, and in his time that he pointed out that because it's an open source development, bugs are much faster to be, found and corrected. Okay, so you would think that open source research would also be that way. There are, but sometimes it is mostly science is self-correcting, but there is a delay, and the delays can be definitely long, right? And so I think that's just the point I was trying to say, that everybody comes up with new benchmarks, and there are different ways of coming up with benchmarks, and it's not clear. So that was the phase. Those two papers, for example, I kept talking during the class about neat versus Scruffy. And with no value judgment, neat in the sense of I can prove theorems, Scruffy in the sense of look, it works. And areas go through these phases. That was certainly, I think the second paper was more of the neat. Let's take a look at what happened and is it making sense? And there would be upfront, I mean, it's not very clear that you should always be neat either. There should be people interested in Scruffy, there should be people interested in neat, and there should be like possibly cycles also. And but obviously you do want to take a look at whether what you are checking is connected to what you should be checking. And it's not obvious. It's a tiny community, and yet it was, there were people who basically were looking at the same problem. They're having these benchmarks, and we were taking part in that. I mean, it wasn't that I'm not putting myself as an outsider in that, we were winning the competitions, while the competition essentially wasn't actually making a distinction between temporal versus non-temporal. And so if you can make that mistake at that time, you can make the mistake even way more so right now, where everything is benchmark based. Everything is benchmark based. And so you should be worried about the claims. And also you should be checking in terms of, I mean, again, depending on the generality of the problem, it might be harder to come up with theoretical properties like required concurrence. Like, for example, LLMs understand language. So, I mean, you can say, give a bunch of examples. Yeah, looks like it works. Bunch of examples, looks like it doesn't work. That's not what we want. We want, like, decide propositions that are actually provable. I mean, they would be good at certain kinds of things and not good at certain kinds of things. And especially proofs would be that given the way LLMs are designed, there is no way they can do this. And that's what computer science used to. And computer science people still think they are doing that, but then on the other hand, computer science became AI mostly, or at least computer science became AI NV field, like every other field. And so they may well be swept up with the same enthusiasms. I'm not against it. It's great to be, in a moving field, in a very fast moving field, but you do have to think about that. So I don't know if I answered your question. Certainly the benchmark people did improve. And again, I think there are people who even now, if you carefully look, people look at what, look at the kinds of problems and whether or not they make sense, even in the current benchmarks in different areas. But most people look at benchmarks from very functional. Look, these are benchmarks about 8th grade reasoning. But the problem is 8th grade reasoning is not well defined. You see what I'm saying? I don't know what is 8th grade reasoning other than by example. Whereas required concurrency is like a very clear definition. You may like it, you may not like it, but it's a clear definition, so you can prove what is true, whether you can do it. Yes.
So one of the comments I made like in the discussion is that, for example, like transformers, there's actually a proof that they can only really compute like polynomial time functions. basically because they're limited in length.
Hmm.
And like, that's interesting because a lot of people eventually end up applying them to like NP hard problems or even like exponential problems, which if you think about it intuitively, just makes not very much sense. And they kind of end up using them as like heuristics.
No, but you do remember, I mentioned this, right? You do remember that the poly versus NP hard can always be tricked by changing the input. You understand what I'm saying? So you have to keep remembering, that MDP is polynomial, whereas TRIPS is p-space complete. Right? That's because essentially the same input that you are giving to strips would be exponentially blown up when you give it to MDP at an essentially atomic level. And the complexity is always in terms of the input size. So I think, I mentioned this to you at some point of time, there's a blow up the input trick that's always possible. If you blow up the input to be exponentially large, then all computation is polynomial. At least the exponential computation will be polynomial in the exponentially blown up input size. You understand what I'm saying? Because, and in fact, instead of MDP, you can think in terms of graph search is polynomial. While strips, which does graph search, is NP hard. It's basically p-space complete. Why does that make sense? Because in one case, you're giving the graph as the input. In the other case, you're giving this compact representation as the input. And in fact, all of AI used to be about implicit search. In fact, there's no difference between A star and what you did in data structures courses. You did graph search before coming to A star. Why do you have to even do graph search again in Intro to AI? And at least the ones that you took, the ones who took course with me, I am telling you many times that A star search does the search on an implicit graph because it doesn't have the extensional representation of the graph. It has a goal test function and a child generator function, which sort of implicitly describes a graph. You see what I'm saying? And the moment you and the point, the interesting question, of course, then is, can you do search efficiently with that sort of a representation? And yeah, so the polynomial versus exponential could very well be, in fact, in most of the cases, essentially, the input size is so big that you don't need to worry about that aspect. In fact, that's a very interesting question as to how exactly are we, not caring about NP hard tests at all. You see that in normal AI, people no longer talk about the deep learning literature. People don't talk about complexity. They might talk about complexity for the gradient propagation steps. That's like not the point, right? Because in fact, you notice that is sort of like saying that, in planning, planning is always p-space complete. Strips planning is always p-space complete. That is the complexity. But then you can also have a very different kind of a religious war saying partial order given a partially ordered plan, checking if it is a solution can be sometimes NP hard. Okay. In particular, if actions have conditional effects. Now, whereas in state space planning, checking correctness of a plan is poly, basically linear. Now, if I look at this versus this, does it tell you that state space planning is better, complexity wise, or not? Do you understand what I'm saying? The point is both this is approach A1, this is approach A2 for solving the same problem. Complexity of a problem class doesn't depend on the algorithm that you're using. Except in the polynomial case, where you essentially show that there exists a polynomial prime algorithm. Otherwise, it's just irrespective of the class of algorithms you're using, the problem takes essentially whatever that NP hard, that is it's an NP hard problem, it's a p-space complete problem also. So given that, you are essentially comparing per node complexity here. This thing is per node complexity. Okay, and the interesting thing is you can always push per node complexity into search space size. Right, instead of looking at a partially ordered plan which has exponential number of linearizations, each of which you have to check, you can put them into different branches. Each branch would be linear plan, like that's what state space planners do. So per node cost would be cheap. But did the cost of the problem change? No, because you just pushed complexity from one pocket to the search space. You guys understand this, right? Now, this is not just for planning. If you, for example, think of the distinction between batch versus mini batch versus stochastic gradient descent, which many of you have heard of, what are they doing? Some of them have much higher per node cost, per step cost, but hopefully will do less number of steps. And some of them do much fewer per step cost. You understand what I'm saying? Again, these are all ceteris paribus arguments. That means everything else remaining equal. And we do know that this difference between state space and plan space planning problem, plan space approaches does become useful. Like for example, I said in temporal planning, you might want to do state space because it's somewhat easier at least to check the linear, the resource constraints, etc. You see what I'm saying? That doesn't actually mean that the temporal planning complexity has changed if you do state space versus plan space. You understand what I'm saying? At least, you could have this. Sometimes it might be possible to at least make some steps before you die. Whereas if you keep all the constraints up in the air, then you would know when you know the first action to be done. Actually, in general, if you have a planning problem, okay, here is another interesting thing that you can say. Another interesting thing that you can say about another interesting thing you can say about state space planning. State space planning, especially forward state space planning, allows for integrating execution and planning. Yes or no? Right? Because you are making steps of the plan, first step onwards. Right? And so if you need to just execute a plan, you can execute the prefix. Whereas if it is regression planning, you only have a suffix. If you have plan space planning, you have a partially ordered plan. You don't know which one to execute. Is this a valid argument? Again, these things are bringing them up because these are all arguments that people believed in. And they're all bogus arguments. It turns out, okay, because how the heck do you know? Just because you decided to arbitrarily put action A1 in the beginning of the plan, do you have any guarantee that there is a legal plan that can have action A1 in the beginning? No. Do you understand what I just said? You really, I can always give you a worst case scenario planning problem where the very first action you do can't become clear until you have a legal plan for the entire problem. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so, just because you're making a plan in the prefix way doesn't mean a squat. Because in fact, what happens in the plan state space planning is you're likely to make a couple of premature commitments, saying I'll make this as the first action, I'll make it the second action. And if you make premature commitments, you feel as if you know where you're going, but then you also realize, oh, it's not working, and you have to backtrack. If you have already executed the first step of the plan, and if it is a world that is non-ergodic, where the actions cannot be reversed, you're screwed. You understand what I'm saying? And yet you somehow agreed when I pointed out that many of you thought, yeah, that does make sense. Like, for basically state space planning is useful because the actions are in the prefix, so I can start executing. That's nonsense. If you really wanted that, then you could still be doing plan space planning, take a topological sort, pick that action and say, I just execute it. In fact, you're probably less wrong in the case of plan space planning than in the case of state space planning. Okay, and what I said was not understood, probably even now it's probably not understood by many people in planning. Once again, they will say, hey, this is good because we get to go. If you go in the direction of the execution, you can execute the first action. That's only because you're making premature commitments. You might say, the only time I would do it is the problem forces me to. Do you understand what I'm saying? The only time I'll do it is the problem forces me to. Essentially, you have to take an action. Whatever you know, you have to basically take an action right now. And like, for example, chess game where every 3 minutes you have to make a move. Chess is a great example in point. The right way, the right move to make as a first move, for sure, is only understood if you do min-max search to the end and figure out what is the first action and do that. Right? But since I said you have to make a move every few minutes, then you might say, yeah, I might as well go in the state space direction. Right? So again, there are so many arguments that make sense, but they're bogus. And I'm just hoping that at least some of them you'll figure out, having seen these discussions. Like forward state space search, you don't have to do forward state space search just because you wanted to be able to execute. In fact, as I said, you could do partial order planning, take a topological sort, take the first action, and be done with it if you want. And the planning book by Dana now, for example, Dana is on my committee, so I shouldn't say anything bad, but I will anyway. That, basically it says that the TS, whatever the heck is that thing called, the TSTM or something, planning, where totally ordered task reductions planning. And they will make a big deal about how a totally ordered task reduction planning is very useful because you can execute the first action. And by the way, this is not, since I'm saying Indiana said that, Leslie, Kelbling and co have a paper called HPN, Hierarchical Planning in the Now. Same bogus assumption. Okay, the only reason the assumption makes sense is if anyway the world is ergodic and it's fully reversible, then you do an action, you do the opposite of the action you did, you will be fine. But I can always, complexity analysis are always about the worst case scenarios. In your language, I can give you a domain where the first action will not be known until the full plan is known. In which case, clearly you just jump the gun. Right? I mean, just because you do something because it can be done doesn't mean that it's a good thing, right? Because, right? So half the time that's what happens. I mean, I have the cake, so I just eat it first. And then you realize, oh, I'm supposed to have the cake at the 15th action. Oh, yeah, I've eaten it already. Right? Okay. Yeah, I don't know how we got into this. What was the question, by the way? What was the question? Who asked the question?
I think I did.
Okay, what did you ask?
I was asking.
So that polynomial versus exponential. The point is that yes, transformers might be polynomial architectures, but then you can always expand the input. And similarly, the point, and then I went from there into saying that if you want some particular computation to be smaller, you can always push the complexity somewhere else. Per node complexity can always be reduced by pushing it into the search space. And that from there, and then that's where we actually made a connection to batch versus all the stochastic gradient, all that stuff, and then from there I also basically pointed out that don't go for syntactic properties of some algorithm that you just like, it may not be changing the complexity of the problem. State space planners do actually make the prefixes, and prefix will tell you the first action to execute. That doesn't mean that they are the good things, because they don't know that the first action they're executing currently is the right first action. You're doing it because it can be done. Like if you have a bomb in front of you, wake up, oh, there's a bomb, let me just blow it. That's not a good action. If you did the entire plan, you would have realized the bomb should actually be diffused. But since you could blow it up, why not blow it up and then see what happens? I mean, currently Twitter is going through that. So Elon is saying, maybe just blow it up and see what happens. He may or may not be able to reverse what he's doing. Yeah.
So on a slightly different tangent, I guess, and something in the paper that kind of stood out to me was that there was this, when talking about planners, there was this decision line, or not decision line, like this line between the two where decision epoch was incomplete but fast, or typically incomplete and fast, and partial order was complete but like really slow. So when talking about tempo, it's talking about how it uses temporary lifted state space and exploiting that to get completeness. But I don't recall anything in the paper that actually talks about how fast does it actually run? Is it still
that's actually a very interesting question. Tempo is a theoretical construct. It was never implemented. Okay. But there is a version, Zeno, which I mentioned in the beginning. It actually was implemented. It was slow, but it was also slow because the computer was slow.
Okay.
Okay. But there are other planners. What is it? What Opti? What's the name of the one that you used? What? Optic. Optic is one of the temporal planners, right?
The one that I used was POP. That is like
POPF. Okay. Yeah. So there are specific planners like POPF, Optic, etc., which actually do expressive temporal planning, and they do support, the more difficult problems, etc. And then basically you can talk about their efficiency. They are actually useful. In fact, that problem has to be solved, and those are the only things that are possible to be used.
So I noticed that. I'm like, this is very theoretical, but like.
No, yeah, because this paper was just basically trying to show that. But all of us knew. In fact, Dan Weld, the guy who was one of the co-authors, actually wrote Zeno. He was the co-author on Zeno because it was his student, Scott and Bertie, who did Zeno. And so everybody knew that partial data planning works. In fact, one of the other tricky parts in general, this whole per node versus search space thing, with respect to the worst case complexity, it is true that this doesn't make any difference. But oftentimes, worst case complexity is not the only thing you're interested in. In fact, that's not even the thing you're interested in. These days, there's no such thing as complexity. So you just want to say, when I'm living, I shouldn't be too, sad. Like, I'm stuck with very high per node cost, then I may not even be able to make any, enough steps. And so oftentimes there would be reasons for pushing per node complexity into the search space size, just so that there is illusion of progress. And I have basically said that illusion of progress is more important than the progress itself. Right? Because oftentimes that's how we get our, internal happiness. That, at least I made a couple of steps. Maybe I'm screwed, but the other guy is still thinking. You see what I'm saying? In the worst case, the steps you made could haunt you. But if it turns out that most of the problems that I'm giving you happen to be, so imagine the following thing. I mean, in fact, if the entire benchmark, temporal planning benchmark was actually didn't require concurrency, then what is the advantage of doing partial data planning? There is no major advantage. Essentially, worst case complexity remains the same, and these guys at least can do better on the average problems. The state space guys. Okay. Yeah.
This might have been like a detail I missed in the paper, but one thing that I was wondering about, especially with as problems require concurrency, now scheduling becomes much more of an issue with the validity of a plan. If two actions need to be scheduled scheduled at the same time and you only have a limited number of resources, that could affect whether you can find a valid plan, right?
For what? I'm sorry, I was adding extra things. So the beginning part.
Oh yeah. So once you have a problem where the only valid plans require concurrency, doesn't scheduling and resource constraints become an issue for finding valid plans? If you don't have enough, if you can't run enough concurrent actions at the same time,
So the idea is that in the partial data plan, hey, I have it. Water. The partial data planning basically says that nobody stopped you from taking, again, that is connected, that's actually connected to one more general idea. Joint versus decoupled versus loosely coupled. This is across AI in general. Okay, you want papers to be published, you say jointly learning language and image, jointly learning action and execution, whatever, You see what I'm saying? Jointly is always a good thing because jointly is, you're taking everything into consideration at the same time. That's true for both reasoning and learning. So if you're doing jointly reasoning in partial planning, your problem won't occur because you are taking into consideration all the resource issues to begin with too, and you have to kill them off if the resources are enough. If on the other hand, the problem with jointly typically is it becomes essentially, the worst case complexity doesn't actually, so if you are looking for, if you want globally optimal plan, for example, or anything really, you need to do jointly. You need to do reasoning about all constraints at the same time. Because otherwise, if I know that you're going to do the actions first and then the resources next and then the walking the third, I can come up with a solution problem for which you will wind up getting suboptimal solution. Right? So optimality requires jointly, but then efficiency requires decoupled. Okay, if I can do, action selection at one time and assuming, infinite resources, and then pretty much whatever actions I select, there would be resources that are actually feasibly allocated, and nobody cares about optimality in that aspect, then I would have a much better life in terms of computational complexity. Right? But the problem typically is if you decouple fully, then you could be arbitrarily far from optimal. And by the way, this is one more thing that is repeatedly rediscovered. This is like a design pattern, rediscovered across everything. So imagine we were talking about abstractions, right? Abstraction was only making sense because you want to live. You screw the optimality part. Anybody who talks about abstractions and optimality together, they're just self-delusion. Right? Because what you do, there'll be very, very, very few problems in the world which will have the property that the optimal abstract plan will actually be, refinable to the optimal final plan. You never really require that. You just want to be able to live. Most of the time we make high-level decisions, knowing fully well that, we may have to backtrack. So in the task and motion planning literature, for example, lots and lots of people are rediscovering. In fact, I was on a PhD proposal just last week where the kid was doing the same thing too, that you rediscover this idea that I have an abstract plan, and then I may be unable to refine it in the lower level, so I have to backtrack. Or I have an abstraction, I hopefully will always be able to more or less expand any plan in the lower level. That essentially means that's like sort of infinite resource scenario where you no longer have a globally tight optimality consideration. It just becomes feasible. If you can do what you thought you will do at the high level, at the lower level motion, then you are fine enough. It doesn't have to be the optimal motion. In fact, no robots which do task and motion planning with abstraction at all claim for optimal motion planning. Makes no sense. It's true for pretty much any. Again, this is one of those are with the, but it's worth keeping in mind that you are giving something up for something. Okay, so with respect to your case, partial planning people can just say, well, if you took that stuff into consideration, then that's the only way you can get globally optimal solutions. And if you don't, then yes, then it becomes a more interesting question of state space planners are making premature commitments and are very quickly backtracking. So the problem is it better to make premature commitments and very quickly backtrack in your head at least? Or you want to think about the overall structure of the plan before committing to any action? And this becomes much, much harder the moment you start actually executing. Because thinking in the head, you can undo. Right? Nothing has changed in the world. You do an action in the world, you may not be able to undo it. Action reversibility is not a given. But on the other hand, you might understand that we have made our world in such a way that pretty much every action is reversible. A little costly, but it's reversible. So we stabilize the world so that bozos like us who are absent-minded can still live. And I normally talk about stabilizing the environment for the kids so that kids, they say you don't want to put kids into a non-ergodic living room with a couple of guns and a few niches, right? And you're thinking you're only doing it for kids, but you're doing it for ourselves too. There is no gun here, thankfully. Although, some states apparently allow those things. But also, there is also no big ditches. While I'm talking, I don't need to keep checking everything. That's not true for the world in the tooth and claw, as they say. It's true for classrooms. Right? So we actually can change the world such that decoupled approaches would be fine. Okay? Yeah.
So for all the other reviews, you've always given us one paper from the reinforcement learning side of things. You didn't do that in this case.
Which case?
In these papers, the two papers that you gave us. This time.
Yeah, I can make, no. Actually, I didn't do it that way. I mean, I don't think I did it for everybody, but this particular one, yeah, I know the pair was essentially just, the one thing that I didn't do is SAPA and the extension of C. But I can send you links to temporal planning in RL. That's like a very small literature because generally most people don't. I should send it to you. I mean, again, many of these things I'm giving you a taste, and especially of things that you might not taste yourself, because you're more likely to taste PALM-DP at state space level than strips planning of any kind. And sometimes, whether you do research in that area or not, understanding the issues will make you think, where did those issues go in the version that I'm doing? I'm a control theory guy, how come the problems are not the same? If I am like doing RL, where did these issues go? So there are, the closest actually RL talks about temporal abstraction is semi-MDPs. Semi-MDPs are basically, they're not even about required concurrency. Yeah.
So I was curious that from SAPA to this tempo, I found like even the papers cited in this paper, like it seemed to be like a small group of people who have been working on this. So what was the process? You spoke about the wow moment. Like the moment you realized about required concurrency, was it immediately obvious what was the solution, or like I just want
no. In that particular case, the solution was known beforehand. It was just a question of why is this other stuff working? In the sense, people knew partial order planning is work. People knew that people just assumed that state space planners won't work. Then people figured out that this fattening idea is a good idea that I was telling you. I mean, instead of just lengthening, if you also fatten, you're getting some kind of a concurrency. And for the longest time, essentially within planning, people assume that the moment you go into time, you can't do state space, like at all. And then there was a small amount of time when people basically for about 5-6 year period, where basically people thought, yeah, it looks like this fattening idea will work. And within those 5-6 years, basically they didn't check whether or not it's working for all possible kinds of problems. I mean, that happens in every research area in general. Yeah. Yes.
So bringing it back to this jointly versus decoupled versus loosely coupled, you talked a lot about the jointly and the decoupled, but is like, what's the balance that you want to try to strike?
So basically most of the world, you will try at least do loosely coupled. So, and the loosely decoupled essentially means there's no backtrack. So you do plan and then somebody else schedules it. I make the plan, throw it out the guy to the scheduler, and the scheduler just schedules it. See what I'm saying? Loosely coupled essentially means you make the plan, throw it over the wall to the scheduler. Scheduler may schedule it, or sometimes they throw it back, saying, yeah, I can't find a schedule for this. Then you need to find a different plan. And in those kinds of cases, it's backtracking, except it is what I would call inter-module backtrack. That means you have to backtrack from the planner to scheduler. I'm sorry, you go from planner to scheduler in the forward direction, but if the scheduler gives up, the planner has to restart its search, and you want it to restart its search in such a way that it doesn't do the same mistake again and again. won't keep on giving the same kind of plan that cannot actually be scheduled. And that requires essentially what has been called typically intelligent or dependency directed backtracking. And this becomes interesting because typically when you have two different modules, they have different internal representations. Doing backtracking within the same module is simple, it's just a search, right? When you're doing across, then it becomes an interesting question of there is like a translation phase between when you're going to backtrack. So the planner sends the plan, the plan is then viewed as a set of assignments to be made by the scheduler, which makes the assignments. If it fails, then it says, the following cannot be, these are the assignments I'm unable to make. And the planner then has to convert that into the failure rate search space. And pretty much most loosely coupled algorithms, whether it's for planner and scheduler, or task planning and motion planning, or any of these things, they actually operate this way. And in fact, so let me just do that. So I'll get to you in a second. So loosely coupled can be planning, scheduling, task, motion planning, discrete, set, continuous. LP. So in fact, if you have a bunch of constraints that have both discrete variables and continuous variables, and the discrete variables are logical clauses, continuous variables essentially are like continuous inequalities, then there was this old thing, in fact, called LP set, which does first a set, finds an assignment, based on that a certain set of linear inequalities get activated. Then the LP tries to solve them, and if it fails, it then sends it back to the SAT saying, give me a different assignment. This stuff is being rediscovered like 18 different times in various other contexts, this kind of idea. Because again, these are the general design patterns, and anybody does any of the loosely coupled, you can always just say jointly. I do things jointly. And well, you have to be paying the price somewhere. You have to be paying the price somewhere, either in the learning cost or in the inference cost, if you're doing it right. Yes.
So do these loosely coupled approaches consider like heuristics that, so the planner would have heuristics that like try to reduce the amount of resources used or try to encourage concurrency, not like actually enforcing that it needs to be in like the joint case? So like it would use heuristics to try to create plans that would be valid by the scheduler without actually testing them, which it could be NP hard.
That's basically what you wind up trying to do. You kind of use some amount of loose reasoning to reduce the chance that the schedule that you send would be thrown back. The plan that you sent would be thrown back saying it's not scheduled. Okay, so like with respect to the class, there's like so much work which is basically doing loosely coupled reasoning. I will give again, a paper that we wrote because I remember that well. We called it real plan because using real makes it real, right? So what does real plan do? It essentially was this very simple idea. I think I may have mentioned this during the course of the semester. Think of blocks world, right? Just blocks world. Blocks world has basically a bunch of blocks and a bunch of one hand. If I just increase the number of hands, is that an easier problem or a harder problem?
It's more hard. It's harder problem.
In general, if I give you there are more hands, would you say it is easier or harder? Assuming that I'm still trying to just solve the problem.
Can I control all the hands?
What?
Can I control all the hands?
No, I'm asking you, how would you basically, I need, my thing is that I have a, initial configuration of the box. I need to put them in a final configuration. Previously, there was just single hand. Now I give you more hands. Yeah, the question is the problem hard or easy? And think about when does it become hard, when does it become easy too? Yes.
So in terms of how quickly I can solve the problem, it seems to become easier because I have more hands to control stuff. But when I think about planning, like which actions to do, the search space increases a lot, and so it feels like it's becoming more complicated.
So a way of saying that could be that actually having infinite number of hands, large number of hands allows me to ignore hands. I say, they will be available. You see what I'm saying? They will be available, right? And so I get to just do reasoning at the context, at the level of actions, and then all the actions which need a hand, they'll say hand designated, and then somebody will actually say which hand who gets which hand. Do you understand what I'm saying? And I would argue that that's what we do in real life. I mean, like for example, the reason I don't do a joint optimization of how do I go from here to San Francisco by also figuring out the specific Uber cab that I will be taking is because I make the assumption that Uber cabs are left and right. If not Uber, then I'll get Lyft. If not Lyft, then something else. So there is a way to get, which makes me avoid thinking about how to get to the airport, a specific conveyance, right? But on the other hand, of course, if you are defining your global optimality consideration in some very tight way, saying it should be the least number of cents the amount of money, including cents, that you spent, and the most comfortable car, that's also the most socially, acceptable, like, taking Uber is socially unacceptable. Right? All those things, then you will have to start realizing that I can't ignore anything. Everything is important. And you will do joint optimization. Now, interesting thing is, if you just take a normal planner, like planning a graph plan or something, and you just increase the number of hands, what will it do? It dies. Why does it die? Because, as I said multiple times back, the way search dies is by taking a dead node and repeating that, the same failure in many, many different ways. So, for example, it might be trying at some point of time in some sub goals to put A on top of B and B on top of A. And it fails. And it realized that it failed because it used hand 1 and hand 2. So it tries with hand 3 and hand 4. And hand 5 and hand 6, and various other combinations. The reason you fail is because also you're putting A on top of B and B on top of A. That's impossible. It has nothing to do with hands, like nothing. But the search engine algorithm doesn't realize it. So it will do unnecessary amount of bad backtracking. By making it ignore the resources, we'll deal with the resources later. It essentially allows it to just say, avoid that problem, because it's no longer, you're forced to say, don't think about how to get to the airport. That's not part of the problem. I'll figure out how to get to the airport. Right? And when you do that, basically the real plan is one example where you can separate out planning from the scheduling assignment. In this very simple scenario. And in some cases, assignment might fail because there are not enough hands in the real world. So then you have to go and find a different. Yes.
Ignoring the resources is a way of abstraction.
What?
Ignoring the resources is a way of abstraction.
It is an abstraction, indeed. Yeah. Loose coupling is itself basically doing, all these things are connected. Abstraction is also connected to jointly. Right? And essentially, if you do everything jointly, then you're not ignoring anything. So, because the way to think of ignoring as abstraction is abstracting away. What did you abstract away? You abstracted the resources away. And what was your assumption? Your assumption is nobody cares what resources I use and they'll always be available. If that is not the case, then that's not the case in terms of the optimization. Then of course, for example, mostly, as I said, loosely coupled algorithms. Doing loosely coupled algorithms, I mentioned to you that I roll my eyes. No, I'm always rolling my eyes. I'm surprised they're not stuck in my head. But people asking for optimality, global optimality, then using abstraction are delusional. What's the point? You have to give up something, right? And it's the same thing for loosely coupling. People who want to do loose coupling and still say, I want global optimality, irrespective of what the objective is, they're also delusional. You must only, it only matters, as I said, I can only ignore how to go to the airport aspect if I know that there will be enough number of fungible ways of going to the airport and the cost of going to the airport is not going to somehow affect my optimality criteria, which is why I ignored it. But honestly, how many times have you not seen? I mean, I've seen this. I spend a ton of time optimizing the, I don't know, that's my problem, optimizing the flight cost. And most of the time, you waste a lot more money on the Uber in the city. I think somebody was saying that somebody the other day tweeted that to go from Bangalore to Madras, they can buy the ticket for 1,000 rupees, but they have to go to the airport, they have to pay 8,000 rupees, or something of that kind. You see what I'm saying? So obviously you ignored what you thought was a detail is not really a detail, but you still deluded yourself into thinking it's a detail. Most of the time we kind of ignore the fact that we never count the costs. Actually, I think one of my students went on a trip. If you ask them, you will know that his airfare basically was only just double the taxi fares. You won't think that way normally. You think taxi fares are like negligible fraction of the airfares, which is why we are optimizing the airfares. Okay. So my point again being that optimality constraints, that decoupling will basically assume that feasibility or optimality only at certain level is important. And the dollars you spend on taxi are coming from a different pocket. Okay. And in general, if in the real plan scenario, if each hand has a different cost, you're screwed. Because you have to consider the hands while doing the planning. And so anytime you do abstraction, anytime you do decoupling, your friend can do jointly and write another paper. So before the friend does it, you write it yourself. Like in the next paper would be the jointly doing, because you can always show some version of the problem where in fact you get that. Yes.
So are there examples? So a lot of the abstractions we talk about are like pretty discrete, like we either consider resources or don't consider resources. Are there continuous abstractions, sort of like we consider, let's say we have double the resources we start with, and we can create a plan doing that, and it's less constrained. And then as it goes on, like sort of online planning, we can reduce that as we have time.
There are variations of these in general, but my point is that's about the techniques. But the bigger issue is don't ever fall for there is a decoupling technique that is both efficient and guarantees global optimality all the time. You have to give up on something. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Basically, unless the problem was easy to begin with. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, so this goes back to the papers that we were reading and what you just talked about with LBSAT. So one of the things that you were citing in the second paper is a paper by Long and Fox, which introduced LBGP, right? is that similar to what you were talking about with LPSAT? Because it also attempts to solve temporal planning, which is and be complete with linear programs.
No, but I mean, basically, by the way, there is the other very big term that's actually, in fact, saying Derek and Maria reminded me, there is the normal way you think in terms of loosely coupled approaches. The most general ideas are modulo theories. So SAT modulo solvers are planning modulo solvers. And it's a technical term. SAT modulo solvers essentially take a problem where there are SAT constraints, and when you assign certain truth falsity assignments to the variables, they will activate some other kinds of constraints. Could be linear constraints, could be quadratic constraints, could be discrete constraints, whatever. You see what I'm saying? So what basically these modulo theories allow is, there is, let's say, SAT guy is sitting here and they will generate their SAT assignment and whole bunch of critiques. We'll look at this assignment, and this assignment for them triggers certain additional constraints. And they're checking whether those constraints are satisfied or not. And that's basically SAT modulo solving. And so if you are actually writing a single computational procedure, which first basically, this is like normally the way things happen in big companies, right? Essentially, Ford will design the car, like something for the sake, right? And then the air conditioning people will look at it. The motor people will look at it. Some other people will look at it. Some other people will look at it and then say, oh, this is not working for us. This is working for others. So essentially, instead of the first designer essentially designing stuff that can work across all possible constraints, that will be jointly designed. There's no jointly design because there's no jointly expert. Right? So instead, you will have a designer who will come up with some design for something, and then various other experts will look and say, yeah, it works for us, it works for us. Now, if you are essentially, instead of the human connection, if you just say, there's a single computational procedure which is generating the SAT assignment, also checking what other constraints got activated and making sure that those are satisfied, that would be SAT modulo theories. And LPGP is an example. LPSAT, LPGP, all of these are examples of modulo theories. And the specific, so they actually should be, and then having said this, I should mention, since anyway, it is not at all what I was going to do, this is all fun stuff, that there is an idea called dynamic CSP, dynamic constraint satisfaction problem. And there actually turns out there are like two different dynamic CSPs. One interpretation is more constraints are added from outside. I mean, CSP or dynamic SAT. Okay. The other is all constraints are known upfront. But giving a value to a variable may activate all constraints known upfront, but some are active, but only some are active. And giving a value to a variable may activate more constraints. This is actually a very useful formalism, it turns out. So for example, I have a variable V, I can say A, B, C, D is the values it can take. And it can also take null value if the variable is not active. You understand what I'm saying? And saying the variable became active is saying v is not equal to null. And so the thing is that there would be a large number of constraints about v taking certain values with other people taking other values, but none of these constraints depend on v taking null value, because null value is like universally unoffensive, right? You're not even active. Okay, so in fact, one of the funny things is that if you're thinking of planning as CSP, you could say there's a whole bunch of variables, and the goal variables need actions as their values, some actual action as the values. And all other variables basically are not yet active. But the moment you take a goal variable and take its act and provide an action to support that goal variable, all its precondition variables now actually need real actions to support them. That means they can no longer be null. So they get activated. This view is actually a very nice way of formalizing, the decisions you make bring additional constraints to be active. You see what I'm saying? Once again, there's actually a paper, I think probably the last paper that I was the single author on, which is planning graph as dynamic CSP. Okay, I'd say not just because I did, the stuff I did, I remember. That's not surprising. But the point is, this is the way in general you can take a whole mass of constraints and sort of keeps only some of them active by just adding this null value to all the variables remains. And then say in the beginning, you can also take a null value, but then, when you take some variables, some values, then they might say certain other variables should have real values, not null values. Which means the constraints that involve those values will become active suddenly. And in fact, planning graph planning as CSP winds up being very connected to that. And in general, SAT modulo anything is best understood that way. Because the variable assignments you made are triggering additional constraints in the heads of the experts, which are these modulo theories. Okay. Any other questions? By the way, generally, the reason I don't believe in just randomly having students present stuff is because if there's a random question, you should be able to answer. Ultimately, intelligence is ability to answer. Turing test was about answering open domain questions. I didn't know that you asked these questions. So in general, reading a single paper will not give you that much of maturity. And you kind of have to, I think it's much better. By the way, I would consider this class from my perspective as like successful because people read the papers, they wouldn't have asked the questions they asked without it. So, and of course, it's not exactly about just what happened to the 15th paragraph of the paper, but the questions that you thought of based on reading are kind of, that's what discussion should be. But then that will happen when now onwards, if you give me an extra semester from now on, we'll have great time. But you want to do something else? Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so so the next part actually I'm going to start basically is so this morning when I woke up, I saw this particular story. How many of you have seen this story before? I showed it in the this thing that can AI write recipes better than humans? We put it to the ultimate test. So Kate Metz here is the New York Times. You see here, Kate Metz is the New York Times technical journalist, technology journalist, and Priya Krishna, I didn't know. She is the food journalist, and so they basically collaborated to see if you can ask GPT-3 how to make various recipes and then just follow what the GPT-3 told you. Right? And then, so for example, because this is Priya Krishna, presumably she, and of course, they're not thinking just in terms of GPT-3. For them, it's like for Priya Krishna in particular, I think it'll be just the AI as a mass, and then people are making all these claims left and right. So, for example, she asked, AI, which means maybe DALL-E or Stable Diffusion, to imagine non-stuffing, and it came up with that picture, which is pretty impressive, right? Many of you could not come up with this picture. Right? I mean, you don't even know what the heck is non-stuffing. Some of you know, but you don't know how to draw. And similarly, they asked the guy, the AI, pumpkin spice chat. Pumpkin spice chat is another, Indian thing. Actually, it's like a pseudo-Indian thing. We don't do pumpkin in India. Anyway, so I get, it's like a fun thing that I can represent America as well as India with full confidence and be wrong at both. But anyway, so that's a pumpkin spice chat. So if you're able to imagine this, right? And then they asked the AI, which is GPT-3, how do I make this? And it came up with instructions. And since Priya Krishna is an actual cook, she followed the instructions. Okay, and she made, this was for this, the instructions finally led her to make this. Doesn't look like this, but screw how it looks. Apparently, it tasted horrible. That's the important part. And then this one is basically became this. Now the point is, you ask GPT-3, it'll give a plan. I mean, by the way, first of all, you guys realize recipe is a plan. Do you understand that? Recipes are plans. Right? You ask GPT-3 for a recipe, it'll give stuff, and you have no clue, and it looks like a good recipe, man. If you are Priya Krishna and you have New York Times supporting your time, you will actually make it and then say it sucks. Right? So basically, this is what their article was. They actually, the article is funny. At some point of time, he also points out that they had some food experts taste. My God, it's pretty hard to be New York Times, anybody, I think. They had to quote unquote taste this monstrosity, whatever the heck that is. And then it looks very bad. I'm not going to taste very bad. Okay, so then that's what they said, and they said AI is still not able to. I mean, that was the title of it, I think. Can AI write recipes? The answer is no. It's not good at writing recipes. And so when I woke up, this is what I saw. So I told kid, GPT-3 can't even stack blocks correctly. How would we expect it to plan for pumpkin spice chat? Okay, I don't know how to make pumpkin spice chat, and GPT-3, and I know how to do, block stacking. I mentioned this multiple times that plans are hard for GPT to make. And in general, whether you can imagine something and whether you can make something are two orthogonally different things. I can imagine myself being like LeBron James, and but I can't dribble the ball. That's sort of occupational hazard. So the point is, imagining and doing are two very different things. They're both important, but they're two very different things. And so in general, as I said, large language models still can't plan is something that I thought, okay, that's like a sign from New York Times that I should be teaching that today. So what we'll do is after you take your 15-minute break, Karthik will do a discussion of that paper that I mentioned before, but he will tell you exactly what he tested, etc. You can ask him more questions. Then based on that, after that, I will get back to Varsha. Okay, 15 minutes.
Something needed read when I want it to make something that makes sense. So I'll give it the prompt and either explain why this is a good idea or explain why this is a bad idea. I do both. And then if one just doesn't make sense, then I can do it. And then it makes a lot more.
This is basically they call this chain of thought prompting. Typically, ultimately, it is this question. You don't argue.
I have more.
The question is the intelligence in the eye of the beholder? That's what becomes.
You don't know what happened.
I mean, the point is, if somebody can visualize this as pumpkin chart spice, I would have assumed that they know how to make it. But that's not true.
Yeah, it's not that it's comprehending and then drawing it's
Yeah.
comprehending.
No, but I mean, obviously, I think you know that there's no such. First of all, the problem is it's hard to figure out how to correctly define comprehension. So that's a big problem. So I want to kind of avoid that, but certainly if you know that
Standing up and stretching my legs.
but it seems also kind of blundering.
Okay, so
Performance.
Yeah, it's good for heuristic and where I use it for learning a story and I needed like a backstory. And it was great.
Schizophrenically maximizing.
Yeah, I think they're generating ideas.
Yeah. Would you like to what? Stretch 9 legs, brother. I would play with that.
Never actually messed it up.
Okay, so.
I haven't done that. Exploit because
Oh, okay. Okay.
All right, so I'll get started. So today I'll be talking about the work I did with Alberto, Sharath, and Professor Rao, which is a benchmark for large language models on planning and reasoning about change. And the result is pretty much glaring at your face right now, which is the title. Large language models still can't plan. So I think most of you guys have heard about large language models more than most due to this class. And you guys know that there are like tons and tons of large language models, which are all different variants of transformers, and they have state-of-the-art performance in natural language processing tasks. So in this, one of the interesting things is that people are not only figuring out how large language models are able to give such a performance in the NLP tasks, but also they're trying to figure out what other capabilities they might have, including things like explaining jokes. So a natural question is to sort of ask about whether these large language models can exhibit reasoning abilities. So another motivation for this talk today is also this thing that they did for in the spirit of Thanksgiving. Even I got a pumpkin spice latte. So they asked GPT-3 whether it would come up with recipes So Priya Krishna here actually gave her sort of preferences in some sense, as in she likes these things, and she asked GPT-3 to come up with various recipes, in which one of them was this interesting pumpkin spice chart. So then, if you actually look at the video that's there, when she first looks at the recipe that is generated by GPT-3, she's like, wow, this seems interesting. And it looks like a proper recipe. But then when she goes on executing those actions that are there in the recipe, she figures out that something is going wrong. And the end result you've already seen, Professor Rao showed you. So this sort of tells us that GPT-3, or in some sense LLMs, are able to give out plans that look like plans, or recipes that look like recipes, but when you evaluate them, they turn out to be something else. So yeah, so with that, previously there have been like works that sort of claimed that LLMs are zero-shot so-and-so, zero-shot reasoners, zero-shot planners and such. But the way like they could make those claims on after testing out large language models on relatively simplistic reasoning tasks. So these are some of the previous benchmarks that are there, and yeah. So based on the results on these benchmarks, they sort of claim that large language models are zero-shot so-and-so. So the problem here is these reasoning tasks do not give, first of all, they're relatively simplistic, and they do not give a reasonable insight as to whether large language models actually have reasoning capabilities. So, and this is an example from our sort of benchmarks. So if you can see that the example prompts in these benchmarks are pretty small, and the example prompts of our benchmark are pretty long. There are two major reasons why we have more involved prompts. In fact, the prompts in our benchmarks are more involved than any of the previous reasoning benchmarks. First reason being that we provide the LLM with an example before asking it to plan on a new instance. So it is a one-shot as opposed to a zero-shot prompt. And we include the domain description along with the prompt. So we sort of mention that these are the actions it can do, and these are the restrictions that it can do on the actions. And this sort of is important because we have to sort of see whether LLMs can, whether LLMs have the ability to plan conditioned on some constraints. So we have 7 test cases in our benchmark, in which the first 2 test cases that you see, plan generation and cost optimal planning, these correspond to actual planning problems, and the rest 5 of them are simpler auxiliary tasks. So we'll go on, we'll go about each one of them. So the first one being plan generation, which is the usual thing of, can the LLM come up with valid plans that will achieve like a specific goal? So to do that, what we do is we first provide the domain description, and then we showcase an instance and the respective plan for that instance as an example, and prompt the machine with a new instance. So that is basically the plan generation test case. It's just trying to see whether LLMs can come up with valid plans. Coming to the cost optimal planning, it's similar to the plan generation, but we also mention that the costs that are associated with the actions, and the optimization metric, as in we want to minimize the cost and see whether LLM can come up with plans with optimal plans. So that is the second test case. The third one being reasoning about plan execution. So it's not just about like these are simpler tasks where here we try to reason, we try to check if LLM can reason about what happens when an action sequence is executed. So given an instance and an action sequence from a particular state, after executing this action sequence, we ask questions about the resulting state. So things like, let's say if it's blocks world, we say after I stack a block, whether a certain predicate is true or false, things like that. So the fourth test case is replanning. Here we try to see if LLM can replan for cases where there's an unexpected change that has happened. So the thing is, we showcase an instance and a respective plan, and while executing the plan, after executing a certain number of actions, there is an unexpected change that happened to the state, and from that change state, we try to we ask the LLM whether it can reach the goal state or not. So that is the fourth test case. And the fifth one is robustness to goal reformulation. This is a much simpler case where it's just the same instance, but we try to obfuscate the goal in sort of different ways. I mean, we specify the goal in different ways. One is we change the goal ordering, as in instead of saying on AB, on BC, we say on BC, on AB, something like that. And the second case in robustness to goal reformulation is full to partial. That is, in the example that we give to the LLM, we provide a fully specified goal, a fully specified state as a goal. And for the instance for which the LLM has to come up with the plan, it's the same instance, but just the goal is specified as a partial state. And the third one is just the vice versa. In the example, we provide a partial state as the goal, and in the example, we specify we provide a fully specified state. So that is the fifth test case. The sixth one is basically we want to see if LLM is able to reuse a prefix of the plan that we provide in the example. So we showcase an instance and a plan, and then we ask a specific type of instance which would require only a prefix of the plan that we provide in the example. So that is the sixth test case. And the last one is we want to see whether LLM can sort of generalize, as in extract the underlying patterns. Like, let's say in Bloxwell, there are specific type of problems where you would want to, all you need to do to reach the goal state is just keep like stacking, picking up blocks and stacking on top of each other. So whether it can sort of figure out these underlying procedural patterns and apply them to a new instance. So these are the 7 test cases, and to sort of ground these test cases into a particular domain, we pick a very simple common sense domain. I'm sure most of you guys already know what this is, Bloxwell. So this has been, of course, a very popular domain in the planning literature, and it has a long history. So we choose this, and all you have to do is, again, you guys know, you just have a set of blocks. You need to arrange these blocks in to a specific configuration. So now we'll look at 2 example prompts from 2 different test cases. So the first test case being, which is plan generation. Here, as you can see, we sort of showcase the initial state. We provide the goal, and then we provide an example plan. Yeah. So this is the example plan. And similarly, we ask for a new instance, we provide the initial conditions and the goal, and then we ask GPT-3 or any LLM to sort of provide a plan. And for this particular instance, GPT-3 provides this response, and then we parse it and sort of check whether the plan is valid or not. And for this particular test case, GPT-3 pretty much gives out the correct plan, it's a successful plan. And so yeah, so the way the way the plan is validated, we don't sort of compare it with the ground truth plan. We just check whether the plan is valid based on the domain theory. You have a question, sorry?
Yeah, just
Yes.
so when you're passing these statements to GPT-3, I'm assuming you're passing them in as like text values or
Yes.
strings. Are you including the bracketed and fully
Yes.
capitalized?
Yes, yes. So the that sort of is like a start token, end token sort of a thing where
Okay, so it is something in the semantics of the GPT-3 requires you to.
not really, but I think it makes it easier to parse, and also they have this. GPT-3 also has this thing of stop tokens where it sort of recognizes when to. Yeah, it sort of structures out the code. So there are like probably infinite number of ways you can sort of do different types of prompt engineering and see which of them work. But this sort of structures out the prompt. So yeah. Yes. Any other questions? Sorry.
Was there any prompt engineering method used to come up with this statement?
No. So this we went with a very standard structure, as in we give the initial state, goal state, and we ask for the plan. So that's pretty much how this is. But maybe, yeah, there might be multiple ways of phrasing these things and checking whether GPT-3 would come to could do better or not. But yeah, but there were also we did try out different sort of ways of specifying, in which change. In fact, we tried specifying just especially when it comes to the domain. 1 second. Yeah, when it came to the domain, we had different versions of domain that we checked on, and we found that this particular version sort of gave it enough information, or sort of gave us better results in some sense. So yes, any more questions? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, the second one, the second example that I sort of showed here is from the test case ability to reuse plans. So in this test case, what we want to see is we want to check whether the large language model can sort of reuse a prefix of the plan that we showcased it in the example. So here you can see that we have the initial conditions and the goal state, and then there's a example plan. And in this particular instance actually uses only a prefix of this plan, which is just this action, unstack blue block from on top of orange block. That is the ground truth plan. So this particular instance just uses a prefix of the plan of the above instance, and we asked GPT the response, and this is the response it gave, which pretty much fails. So it says unstack blue red. First of all, the action is invalid because in the initial state, the blue is on orange, so it doesn't meet the preconditions. So in some sense, most of the failure cases of GPT-3, we had no issues parsing them, but they were not valid, which sort of also, yes. Yeah.
I was going to ask on the previous slide, why do you only fully specify the goal state for the second statement and not for the first one? Because the first one, the goal statement is just a partial specification of one of the variables.
Right.
But in the second half, you specify a bunch of other confounding information.
Right. So the way these sort of prompts are generated for most of the test cases are they're automatically generated. So what we do is we try to find a new instance where we can where we select a random prefix of the plan, and we execute it, and whatever state the resulting state is, we choose random amount of predicates from the goal state and specify it as the goal state. So that's how it is. Yes.
Was there any negative example given in the prompt? Like I see many positive case here.
No, this is a negative example in the sense where the plan.
Like multi-shot kind of learning where you provide positive example as well as negative example and
In the sense you're saying that, okay, you provide another plan which says that this is not the right plan for, is that what you're saying? Yeah, in some sense, the idea here was to just like sort of check.
Actually, so let me answer. So basically, that idea almost is never tried on a GPT-3 thing, because if you think of reasoning, there's just so many wrong answers. Which of them are you going to give? I mean, you can do it, but it doesn't necessarily help. I mean, there's like a couple of things that work and a billion things that don't work. Okay, whereas you're thinking more in terms of general positive, negative examples for classification tasks. That might be simpler, but but this one essentially there's just so many, especially when you're doing it in the short learning, few short learning. Then it's like if you, for example, I'm only allowing you to give like 3 shots, right? Using all 3 for positive plans is way better than using 1 for positive plan and 2 for not working plans, because plans cannot work, can be not working for many different ways. There is a whole entire idea which maybe worth thinking about of near miss plans, but then that would be your teaching essentially. It may be a kind of a prompt engineering. I mean, near miss plans may well be a kind of a prompt engineering. I don't know whether that will help or not. Again, even as we are sitting here and talking about whether or not it helps, the tricky part of GPT-3 is, why is any of this supposed to help? Given how it is trained, why is any of this supposed to help? Right? And we're just basically trying to see maybe it will, and then we can write another paper. So, for example, near miss things could be tried, but that could be a kind of a planning specific prompt engineering. Actually, one of the earliest machine learning thesis was by this guy called actually Patrick Winston. Lucas sorry to get close with him or something. Anyway, so and Patrick Winston's stuff was all about near misses. So he basically will not only say this is an arch, this is something that looks like an arch but is not an arch. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, but then you are very carefully picking negative examples. People do use negative. I actually, during teaching, I mean, those of you who did intro to AI with me know that I tell you how people make mistakes in theorem proving, for example, because there are certain kinds of mistakes that people make and you bring them up. But that very careful prompt engineering, and in fact, whether or not that would be helpful is worth checking, but it's also not just giving an example. It is giving very carefully. This is more likely the kind of a mistake you might make, and you should be careful about it.
There was also some like works saying that since you're putting all of this in the text format, if you say that I do not want this, GPT-3 doesn't really sort of differentiate. Sometimes negative examples sort of don't work. They just use it as in the sense that it sort of said that just because we say it in the text form, I do not learn, this plan doesn't work. GPT-3 doesn't really take that into account. So there were also some works related to that. All right. So yeah, so for this, this is sort of a failure case for the ability to reuse plans test case where GPT-3's plan doesn't work. So in order to sort of, we did mention that like blocks world in some sense is easy enough for us, but we wanted to provide like a concrete baseline for Bloxworld. So what we did is we performed a user study with 50 participants, and we asked from the 500, like from the instance set that we provided to GP3, we picked up a random instance and asked these 50 participants, each of them a random instance, and they had two phases of interaction. One where they just write up the plans, and then later on they translate the written plans to the nearest action set. So out of 50, 39 of them came up with a valid plan, and out of 39, the 35 of them actually came up with an optimal plan. They were not required to come up with an optimal plan. So this sort of gives us a preliminary human baseline to compare the performance of GPT-3 against. So the results of GPT-3 are pretty much like this. So for the first two test cases, which correspond to actual planning problems, you can see GPT-3 is pretty bad at it. And we also tried with Instruct GPT-3, which is a fine-tuned version of GPT-3 on human instructions. We also tried on an open source large language model called Bloom. And these, all the three pretty much, they had pretty bad results. So one thing maybe you might have observed is that for Bloom, we only tested like 200 instances on plan generation and 100 instances on the rest. Part of it being that Bloom took 36 hours for a single test case to run, whereas GPT-3 and Instruct GPT-3 being APIs, since the model was hosted on their infrastructure, it was much faster. So yeah, but the main point being here is that our titles hold, large language models still can't plan. Yes.
Do you like what's your analysis of when you're doing like shuffling goal predicates and the performance is like relatively okay? Like actually,
right. So if you actually look closer at the goal reformulation test cases, all they had to do was just repeat the same plan that was provided in the exam, and yeah, and we just specified the goal in a different format. That's it. And even there, they sort of they perform okay, but it's.
What about like in the full to partial planning? So is that like what's happening there with Instruct GPT-3? Like, is it some small change like that, or is it still?
In the sense,
so like you have like the full to partial planning,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like is that one similarly like just some way that GPT-3 can cheat, or is there like actually something going on?
No, it's pretty much the same sort of like it's the same instance. We just give a fully specified goal in the example and a partially specified goal in the instance that it has to come up with a plan.
But 76%, does that mean it solves the plan correctly?
So out of 500 instances, yeah, 346 instances, it could successfully come up with a plan, which is pretty much the example plan.
But like, why is that one higher than like the 5% or something?
Why is that higher than?
Than like just normal plan generation.
Yeah, that's because it's probably one of the reasons could be that again, all it had to do was just repeat the plan that was provided in the example. The instance is the same. So it just sort of figured it out and replicated the same plan in some instances. So there is no pinpointed like reason as to why they were able to do any of this stuff, or why in some sense it makes sense that they're not able to do plan generation because even with fine tuning, in fact I'll talk about that too. Even with sort of we sort of fine tuned GPT-3 with like 1,000 different Bloxworld instances, and even after that there's like an uptick, but it still stops at like 20% of the instance. It solves like just 20% of things.
Right. So
yes,
can you tell us like how did you create instruct GPT-3? Did you use any kind of transfer learning?
Oh, no. So the Instruct GPT-3 is actually like a newer version of the GPT-3 models itself, and that is different from the fine-tuned version that we did. So the fine-tuned version that we had was, so we trained the original GPT-3 with 1,000 instances of blocks world domain, and the way we did it is the data set had like initial state, goal state, and the plan is the completion.
Was it similar in case of Bloom as well, the training part?
No. So we just fine-tuned just GPT.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So were all of so you're trying to get GPT-3 to output in the form of saying like move block 1 onto block 2, basically. But I'm wondering if the fact that GPT-3 has been trained mostly on like human language means that you're losing something by having the output be so parsable, I guess, like to a machine.
So in the sense, what you're saying is maybe the language, since we're doing it in like a natural language sort of a thing, is that your question?
So the output that you're trying to get the machine to give is like move block 1, block 2, but that isn't.
Oh, not really. I think so. If you actually look at the GPT-3 response there, it is like a full sort of an action where it says unstack the blue block from on top of the red block, and then.
Okay, that's what I was curious about.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Would it have helped if you said specify blocks by number instead of color? Because if you had multiple colored blocks in different situations, that had confused the GPT-3 model.
Right. I would assume that it shouldn't color be something of a more.
Yeah, but I guess like numbers would be unique, like what's said.
Like even the colors in some sense are for each instance there are blocks are of unique colors. There are no multiple blocks of the same color. Yeah. So it's pretty much equivalent in that sense. Yes. Okay.
So I was wondering, since like the length of like the GPT plan is like the same, like it's 4 steps as long as the plan that you did it generally match the length of the plan with the response, or was it variable?
For the successful cases, there were like as in whether the length of the GPT response matched to the
initial
ground
most
truth.
of the time.
Yeah. For most of the successful cases, it did, but there were cases where it had like a lengthier plan, but it's still valid because it reaches the goal state. Right. So did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other question.
Yes.
On the ideas of improving it, one thing I found when I've asked GPT-3 to make decisions is I get way better results when I include after it like make your decision and then explain why you did that.
So that sort of is also linked to this thing called chain of thought. In some sense, they sort of provide like let's say currently the state is this, and then I pick up, then the state becomes the state is this, and then I put, and then this is what happens and stuff like that. So we did do like a very small experimental setup where we actually provided, after executing a certain action, we provided the resulting state for each of the plans. So like from the initial state, if I unstack the blue block from on top of the orange block, the resulting state is so and so. And then after I put down the blue block, the resulting state is so and so. Things like that. And then we asked GPT-3 to count, and it was the results were pretty bad in the sense that it was, some of them were not even like parsable. it was going on random tangents. Yeah.
Actually, I mean, the only thing I would say is it's not strange that it doesn't do well in chain of prompting. It is strange that it does well in some cases, like seemingly does well in some cases with chain of thought prompting, because there's actually no reason for it to make any sense whatsoever, unless it reminds it of something in the training data, the vast training data. You know, actually, there has been this whole entire discussion that, you know, that basically there are enough worked out examples in for like simple math problems that people do, that essentially that it's just, that's what it's reminding me of. I mean, in fact, there's a variation of the chain of thought prompting which just becomes a magic incantation saying, what is it? Let's do it step by step. That's it. You just have to say, let's do it step by step. And it basically, and obviously it doesn't make any sense. I mean, you know, the only reason it makes sense is that the only reason it could make sense, one reason it could make sense is there are enough examples in the training data that had things like, let's do it step by step. And then so it just sort of triggered that association in essence. So, yeah.
In your domain description, when describing your action, you say pick up a block takes 1 minute. That's the only action you can give like a time value to.
So that is only for the cost optimal planning test case, where we sort of specify costs in terms of time taken, and then we ask GPT-3 to come up with a plan that that minimizes the.
So your different tests could have a different domain description, or is that just?
No, that's just for the optimal plan. So yeah, we were at fine tuning. Okay, so yeah, we did sort of look at fine tuning, and there was an uptick in the results, but still it was around 20%. There's actually a paper that sort of talks about how learning to reason from data, you'll only have the models learn statistically relevant features and not actually like the cause and effect sort of a thing to actually perform well. And that sort of reflects in our studies. There is like a slight, there's like an uptick, but then it still is at around 20% after fine tuning it with 1,000 instances of blocks. So yeah, there's like a bunch of things that that can be done. As I said, one of which is prompt engineering. So there is this work called prompt, where they say that this LLM seem to do better if you instead of specifying it as like a natural language thing, if you specify it to or if you ask it to fill up functions in Python code, it is able to sort of come up with better plans in some sense. So such kind of things, there are a lot of prompt engineering stuff that can be done. Chain of thought reasoning is another. And this is just the blocks world domain that we tested on. You can extend it to other common sense domains like virtual home, where you're picking up different things, you're moving around rooms and stuff like that. Or you can also have like you can extend it to specialized domains. Currently we only accounted for like the complete correctness of the output plans. As in, if it could very well be that some of the actions in the plan could be helpful. That also sort of connects to maybe we can use LLMs as some sort of a heuristic to sort of see whether it can improve the quality of the plans if it is accompanied with a sound plan, stuff like that. Yes.
Okay. Did you all ever consider evaluating whether it can learn like a simple world model? So for example, if you give GPT-3, like, here's the current state, I execute this action, like, what is the next state?
Yeah, so that sort of, yeah, that is part of one of our test cases. We actually didn't test that because that's the reasoning about plan execution. So we provide an action sequence and from a certain state, and then we ask some questions about the resulting state. So we do not ask what the resulting state is. Currently, we ask like a binary question. We're trying to see if there is something that is more descriptive in some sense about like instead of just asking whether a certain predicate is true or false, maybe there might be some.
Yeah, so I guess like in theory, like that would kind of be a prerequisite to doing any kind of planning, right? You'd have to be able to actually generate the next full state. So that would be an interesting thing to try. My other question is, so like this domain is kind of artificial. And I mean, it's very useful for like planning research, right? But it might be interesting to try another domain that is more similar to like GPT-3's training data. So for instance, like recipes or like
Recipes is what they try.
exactly. Yeah, so you wouldn't really expect it to work, right? But it might be a more fair comparison.
Yeah, I would still assume Bloxworld is in some sense a pretty commonsensical domain as to recipes that could, well, people have already tried that and you can see the results.
I feel like a systematic like
Right.
would be interesting.
Yeah, you can always extend it to other sort of commonsensical domains.
I think in general, I mean, the point is, I was just preparing my tweet for this evening, which will come out, but which is that that basically I just showed to myself that LLMs doing reasoning is like high school students curing cancer every year exactly in time for the science fair. Right? I'm surprised that cancer hasn't been cured by now because they've been curing it every year, right? It only makes sense if we use very generous and patronizing standards. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, so it's like, yeah, good. Let's wait for the next year's cure of cancer. None of them actually do it. We are just happy that high school students have some interest in science at all. And similarly, if it gives a plan and you sort of basically say, yeah, looks like a reasonable plan, then that way everything is a plan. In fact, I have one of mechanical engineering professor students, kids, was a very good family friend, this guy called Tutan. And I remember when I was like a little kid, he would be giving me driving plans. He will to come, like he would say, we just went to this restaurant and I said, oh, that's a nice place. And how do I go there? He says, oh yeah, do this, and then hang a quick left. And what he got was the hang a quick left part. The rest of the directions were like total bogus. Okay. But then we all said, wow, Tutu knows how to do a hang a quick left. That's one part that he figured out. So it's like a very patronizing way of checking whether the plan is correct. And by removing yourself and actually checking whether the plan works, which is exactly what the New York Times guys said, which is, if they basically showed the recipe to you bozos, including myself, okay, does this look like a reasonable recipe? Yeah, it looks like a reasonable recipe. The question is, would you eat it if I make it? Do you understand what I'm saying? That's when it is a plan. Right? And the thing is that we are being specifically ungenerous. We are just saying, if you say it's a plan, it should work. Because everybody else in your life, GPT-3, has been too patronizing to you. They're just saying, looks like a reasonable essay, looks like a reasonable completion, looks like a reasonable poem, looks like everything reasonable, right? There is actually, the point is, given a prompt, there are like a gazillion things that are reasonable essays. My point, I always ask people, write an essay yourself, just write one yourself, okay? And give the first paragraph of that essay to the GPT-3 and see what is the chance that GPT-3 comes with the rest of your essay. Right? And basically, it's quite impossible. Basically, any random completion which is kind of coherent and grammatical, we are impressed. You see what I'm saying? So that's the thing, that's what, in fact, this whole thing started, believe you me, basically, I would only care about the first two parts. The rest of it was already patronizing stuff that was put in there so that GPT-3 will work, at least okay, because Karthik and Alberto and Sharath wanted it to work a little bit, otherwise it will be too mean. I don't care about being mean to the students. I mean, I just want to know how much you really know. I don't need to make you feel, I don't need to be patronizing. I mean, to you saying, oh, it looks good for a guy who's a grad student, you already understand blocks work. I don't need to say that. So I think that's the point. So if it's a plan, it should be executable. If it's not an executable plan, what is it for? And remember, there was a whole entire discussion. The complement of this today's thing is this other discussion that I already had at the time of heuristics, where this could potentially be heuristics, but with no guarantees. In the sense, the recipe that it provides might be something that will trigger the right recipe for you. It's like, you see basically maybe this is what you should do. And then you use your common sense to kind of correct all the errors, etc., for example. In that sense, it could be a heuristic and it could be a useful thing. But don't say that it's reason.
It's just kind of absurd that like people put so much effort into getting GPT-3 to plan or something like that. It doesn't really make sense.
No, but I mean, even reasoning, why are they doing reasoning? I mean, it's like, I think the most popular title now is GPT-3 is a zero shot, whatever you want to say. So, and that's just, and then if it doesn't work, then we say, chain of thought prompting will help GPT-3 too. And it's basically makes, and then why would you be believing this? Well, I'll make a benchmark. Who made the benchmark? We made the benchmark. And you know all the issues of the benchmarks. And so it's like, there is a certain level of suspension of disbelief, that it's exactly as I said. I mean, I think we kind of, how do we really believe that high school students are every year curing cancer? Have you ever read this stuff on every year on the day, Intel Science Fair thing has been given? I have basically said, the first time I thought, oh my God, good, at least I won't get cancer. And second year again, they cured cancer. Third year again, they cured cancer. It's been going on, and the cancer is still there. Why? Because we are patronizing. We are basically just happy enough that these kids made some poster, essentially, compared to other people who are not even doing that. Which, is very different from saying, I'm a biologist who know how to do molecular biology and know how to cure cancer. What is the possibility of doing something? So I think there is a self-delusion that is possible when we say, this is the same exact thing, by the way, that we had this whole discussion about GPT-3 was being used to do common sense queries that I talked about like 1.5 years back. And this is not the ethical queries, ethical dilemmas. And it's totally nonsensical because if you change a few things here and there, its answer completely changes. So it's like we are making, this stuff where this is good for writing papers, but Lord help anybody who's actually putting this in user facing, or even worse, like executable scenarios where there are no guarantees whatsoever. Okay. It might improve, but I think there are better ways of improving it than just saying, can something else that we did to complete sentences also do this? So that's probably. Are you done?
Yes.
Okay, good. Then let me come and change that, and then I'll talk for 15 more minutes, more, whatever, and then yeah, I can do it. Okay, so okay, so basically what I'm going to do is introduce the high level points about the state space planning, and then I'll give you a couple of papers to look at, and then when we still are alive and well, November 18th, we will have more discussion on that. Okay. Yeah, so the one thing of all the things, the thing that everybody pushes under the rug in AI is partial observability, right? I mean, you think deterministic, stochastic, people feel very good that at least they handle stochastic. But stochastic still assumes full observability. And I hope you guys realize that, right? MDPs don't do partial observability because they don't know before doing the action what state they will go to. But when they go to the state, they know exactly what state they are. Whereas partial observability means you don't know what state you are in. And normally from an atomic state perspective, essentially, let me see, actually, one thing that go back. I'll come back to these in a minute, but what happened? Okay, anyway, I thought I made a slide, but it's okay. From an atomic state perspective, essentially, you could either have instead of you'll wind up doing search in the space of belief states. Okay, in the context of discrete states and belief space, if you are considering probabilities. Belief space will become an actual distribution over states. Okay, so let me give you what I want to do is actually get you to think in terms of just general scripts planning, which is basically what you know already, and then say what happens. How do we consider observability in that particular perspective? And the simplest way to think of it is that there are a bunch of propositions. I mean, this is normal scripts planning. There's a bunch of propositions, the initial state and the goal state. And then O is the number of the actions, scripts operators, right? And then this would have been the normal scripts planning, except now I'm saying there's a subset B of P. B, which is a subset of P, which is a set of propositions that are actually observable. Those are the only ones you know whether they're true or false. You understand what I'm saying? Now, for this to become scripts planning, what do I need to do? If I make B equal to P, then it's scripts planning. Right? If B is a subset of P, then it is essentially partially observable. Okay, and the other thing is if B is empty, then that means you can't see any state. You don't know which state you are in, like ever. Okay, and so that is like a special case of like full unobservability. Okay, in general, this basically because of the unobservability, that's what we just said, if P equal to B, it's the problem is fully observable. If B is empty, the problem is non-observable. If B is a subset of B, it's partially observable. Okay. And then, so one of the things that happens in terms of just this, the fact that you can only observe certain fluids, this is one particular kind of, observability problem. If you can only observe certain kinds of propositions, then in essence, you might wind up having two states which agree on the observable propositions, but they may still be disagreeing on the unobservable propositions, unobserved propositions. And so the overall state space is now split into equivalence classes, because just by observation, you can't tell that these two are different. So for example, if I look at two students, both of them look as if they're looking at me, right? But one of the unobservable thing is, are they actually hearing me? Right? So from my perspective, it's like the people who are looking at me are basically in the same equivalence class, and people who are actually sleeping are in a different equivalence. You see what I'm saying? Just because you're looking at me doesn't necessarily mean that you're understanding what I'm saying. You're even hearing. Forget about understanding. Understanding is a completely big unobservable, but even hearing. You're just looking at me and maybe think of something else, right? So that's the unobservable part, and because of which they'll become, basically the equivalence classes. And then one of the interesting thing is to realize that observability partitions a state. So basically, first of all, you have to realize that when a complete state, if you have P propositions, then the complete state gives truth false values to all the propositions. Right? Imagine the following thing. P is P1, P2, P3, blah, 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 and P3, and then also Q1. Okay, and then it turns out that this is B. That means only the propositions P1, P2, P3 can be observed. Q1 cannot be observed. Right? Then if I tell you that I have a state S where P1 is true and not P2 is true, P3 is true, that state actually could have Q1 true or Q1 false. You see what I'm saying? It's a partial state. Partial state basically is a set of complete states. You understand what I'm saying? So in general, then basically these are not complete states. These are called belief states. And the belief state is a disjunction of states. So this really corresponds to P1, not P2, P3, and Q1 is one state. And similarly, P1, not P2, P3, and not Q1 is the other state. And if I actually have, instead of Q1, I have Q1, Q2, Qk, then each state corresponds to 2 power k states, right? Because Q1 to Qk are unobserved and they can be true or false, and so each state will become 2 power k. Each belief state corresponds to 2 power k. Each belief state can have 2 power k state members. Okay, and normally then what happens is that there are 2 types of planning that you consider. One is nonsense or conformant planning. Okay, or nonsense means no sensing. So it means you don't sense, even though you basically try to go with the belief states and reach the goal state. The example of that is the blocks. I'm sorry. The example of that is the bomb in the toilet problem. Right? Okay, bomb in the toilet problem. You can solve it without actually checking which particular package has a bomb. By basically just dunking both of them in the flush. So dunking the package into the flush. So basically you have a package. You can know that it corresponds to the complete state. There is a package and the package has bomb, or the complete state there is a package and the package doesn't have bomb. Okay, it's like basically what you see corresponds to 2 different states. Right? And so if I don't want to actually, the ones that are not observed, if I want to still reach the goal without observing, without actually trying to observe the missing variable, and still want to reach the goal, that would be conformant planning. That is nonsense planning. That means trying to reach the goal without actually checking the status of the unobservable variables. Okay, and in the case of conformant planning, the search is basically the same as A-star search. If you think of strips as basically doing some kind of an A-star search in the space of states, now conformant planners do search in the space of belief states. It's a much bigger space, but they're still doing search in the space of belief states. Okay, so the search itself remains the same. Whereas in the case, the other possibility is that you can have actions that you can take that will give you the value of some of these missing variables. So that is called the sensing action. And up until now in planning, we only thought of causative actions. Actions that you take will change the world. Right? Because whatever effects of the actions are, those are going to change the world. Okay. If I find out what the value of Q1 is, I didn't change the value of Q1. I just found out the value of Q1. So those are called the sensing actions that change my mental state, not the world. And in particular, if you are in, if you are in this, for example, if you are in this particular belief state, and you said sense Q1. That's a sensing action. There are very interesting semantics for this. During execution, if you sense Q1 and it'll tell you Q1 is true, then you know actually that you are in this state. Do people understand what I just said? Yes, I'll come get to you. Okay. Whereas during planning, if you are planning to sense Q1, you can't also plan to sense Q1 to be true. That's not sensing. You see what I'm saying? You cannot plan to make something true. You have to actually sense and see what its value is. So if in planning you decide to put in an action called sense Q1, suddenly the plan is no longer a line plan, it branches. Based on the value of that test, if the Q1 is true, do this. If the Q1 is false, do this. Do you see what I'm saying? Sensing essentially splits the belief state in planning. It's a very useful thing to understand. This happens all the time. Whenever you're thinking of doing a sensing action, all you're doing is you're taking a belief state and splitting it, partitioning it into multiple branches. Yes.
Wouldn't a change in the world also result in a change of your mental state, or is the change in the mental state only occur when you're actively observing or sensing?
No, actually, I mean, that's so my point is, first of all, I mean, we are not doing the attention part, which is that just because something is observable doesn't mean I observed it, but I assume that everything is observable, everything that is observable, I did observe it. And the thing that Q1 is not observable, so I don't actually, it's not observable by default. It's not observable by default. So if I do a sensing action, I can find out the truth value of Q1. Okay, in that particular case, when I find the truth value of Q1, I didn't change the world, I changed my head. Who is thinking of Heisenberg right now? Anybody thinking of Heisenberg? You better think of Heisenberg, because Heisenberg had something to say about this, that you cannot sense without changing. But he was a bozo stuck in quantum world. Right? It is true that in the quantum world, to actually measure, you affect the value that you are measuring. That's the connection. Okay. Whereas in the macro world, just because I checked whether the door is open, I'm not going to cause the door to become, cause the door status to change. A bit of Heisenberg stuff occurs when I ask people questions, sensing questions. Are you happy? You really happy? The way you ask the question, you can change their happiness. And this is what you use in surveys. That's what you use in polling. Are you really happy with the current government? Seriously? So, but when you ask the door, are you really open or not? It's not going to change its mind. It's just the door is inanimate. Whether it's closed or open, when you looked at it, unless the photons are so big that it's like hitting the door and changing its position, you haven't changed the world when you sense. You only change your knowledge of the world. So in general, in logic, they talk about knowledge state. And sensing allows you to get the knowledge state. By the way, this is all connected to mental models, just because I said so right now, right? Because when you're talking about what people want, that is something that's unobserved. And you have to either make assumptions or you have to ask them, what do you really want? But even if you have no people, if you just have a simple environment and a planner, the moment you have variables with some variables are observable, some are not observable, then suddenly you have this whole interesting notion of belief states. Okay. So in general, I want to kind of quickly go over in the next 10 minutes or so, the big points, and then I'll make you read like a paper so that you'll get more details. Okay. So in general, if you're thinking in terms of basically the strips kind of domains, if you can think of normal complete states to be interpretations. So if you have a logical theory with propositions P1 to P100, right? Basically an interpretation gives a valuation to every one of the propositions. A belief state cannot give value. Basically, if you don't, belief state says that you don't necessarily know the values of some other variables. That means you don't give them the values. So it becomes partial state. Partial states are logical formulas, not logical interpretations. You have already seen partial states in this class, in strips planning. In fact, I think Karthik was going on and on about it. But in classical planning, goal state is partial, right? Because you just say what goals you want, which basically means I don't care. I want A on top of B, B on top of C. I don't care where D is. I don't care where J is. I don't care what kind of color of your shirt is. I just don't care about it. The ones that I don't care, essentially, I don't have the valuations of them. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So in a way, actually, I mentioned this in the very beginning of the class that not knowing some of the variables in the goal state is a good thing, because that means I'm not being very picky which goal state you reach. Whereas not knowing some of the variables in the initial state means that I'm in possibly multiple initial states. I'm in actually a belief state. Okay, so in general, if you're doing regression, if you're doing progression kinds of things, essentially the belief states will be normal logical formulas. Any arbitrary logical formulas. Arbitrary logical formulas have canonical forms. Intro to AI 471. CNF and DNF. Remember CNF and DNF? Conjunctive normal form and disjunctive normal form. And it turns out that those are quite useful canonical forms. If you actually take an arbitrary logical formula and convert it to the DNF form, you can do progression very easily on it. Because DNF is a disjunction of conjunctions. And generally, you can do progression operators on those. I'll actually show you examples. On the other hand, if you put it in the CNF form, it's easier to do regression. Okay, just to give you an examples here, let me just go belief search examples. So progression regression. So it would look like this. A progression search in a belief state looks like this. Okay, so essentially I have a belief state which has been written in the DNF form. So it looks like states with variables, some variables not being given values. And then you can talk about, if I know that A3 is an action which requires M, and if R is true, it gives L. Okay, then if I do A3 in this, then basically this is like kind of state 1, state 2, state 3. I would put caps because they're not complete states. Okay, and then actually, in fact, they can even be complete states. You can put it in the DNF form and make them complete states too, by just considering every unknown variable to both consider both the true form and the false form in the conjuncts. Then what happens is each of these states can be separately processed, and you'll get these 3 states. You see what I'm saying? And then I do an A5, I'll get these states. And then the interesting question is, in this particular case, imagine that I wanted, in this problem, what I wanted, it turns out is I wanted L and G to be true. I'm going fast on this, but I'll go over it again later on. But so in this particular belief state, one of the constituents of the belief states does have LNG. That means you are possibly in a world where LNG is true. But to be sure that you are in a world where LNG is true, you should make sure that all of these also have LNG. So in general, you would say a belief state satisfies a goal if every constituent state of that belief state satisfies that goal. And pure conformant planning essentially would try to go from the initial state, which is incomplete, to a belief state where every state in the belief state satisfies the goal. That's what happened in the bomb with the toilet bomb. Okay, a probabilistic version of this would, for example, say, suppose I have a belief state which has 100 states. In the 99 of them, goal is true. One of them, goal is false. Then it's not true in the belief state. It's not necessarily true in the belief state. But you would like to say that something which has 99 things, 99 states having the goal true is much better than something where only one of the states of the 100 have the goal true. To do that, you need to start, either you have to assume that all worlds are equally good, in which case you start thinking uniform probability for states, and then you can start talking about essentially probabilities that the goal is true. And once you start doing that, you can actually allow for actions with probabilistic effects, and then do probabilistic conformant plan. Okay. In terms of, and then basically it turns out that you can do for the same problem, you can also do regression style search, where it's much more useful to think of the belief state, that is the goal state belief state, as a CNF form, turns out. And it's still again regression. But this is for conformant plan. If you are doing sensing in the middle of the planning, then you have to start considering, let me see if I can get there. If you do sensing in the middle of the planning, that's conformant planning. That's a progression example I just distributed. I want to show you example of, actually, let me show you this too. One interesting thing, remember the class started with robust planning? Right? One idea in robust planning is that I have a, one way of talking about robust planning is there are models, the action models, such that I don't know all the preconditions and I don't know all the effects. If I don't know all the preconditions and effects, I have a partial model of the world. If I have a partial model of the world, how do I do planning it? And one thing you can do is you can say, so for example, here's an action A, it definitely requires precondition P1 and it definitely gives whatever, the deletes precondition, effect P2, but this P1, and it actually definitely deletes P2 and definitely, sorry, not this, the dotted lines are possible. So it definitely deletes P2, deletes P3, but it may delete P1, it may give P2. It's possible. Those would be essentially actions that are incompletely specified. So, some of their preconditions, some of their effects, not all of the preconditions. If I can make plans with these kinds of models, then it's a kind of robust plan. And the interesting thing is that you can think of, you can think of a robust plan essentially as if you have actions with possible preconditions and effects, you can imagine that there are magical initial state variables. If only you knew what their valuation is, you would know if the effect will happen and if the precondition will be required. That means if I have a possible effect E1, then I will generate something called, I'll have a unobservable variable called E1 generator. That will be in the initial state. And if the E1 generator was true, the effect would have actually occurred. If the E1 generator is false, the effect wouldn't have By doing that, I can convert actions which are with possible preconditions and effects to fully specified actions. And it just becomes a conformant planning. You see what I'm saying? So conformant planning, where you're trying to get by without sensing, can also be used to model certain kinds of robust planning problems. And the last thing I want to mention today, before we go away, is that in sensing, so this is a simple progression algorithm in the presence of pure sensing actions. Okay, the point of pure sensing action essentially is that it will just give you the value of a variable whose value is not known and doesn't change anything else. You do realize that the world doesn't have pure sensing actions. X-rays tell you whether your heart is okay. You have 18,000 X-rays, you die. Why? Because there is no such thing as a pure sensing action. X-rays also basically make you start having radiation poisoning. Okay, in general, sensing actions have costs and they will sense something, but at the expense of changing some other variables. So it's like a variation of Heisenberg coming in. But this is something that this is the reason why you don't have too many X-rays. Right? But assuming for a minute that you have pure sensing actions. Right? Then what happens is that basically if I am in a belief state and I have a goal G to achieve and my plan is currently empty, then here is a recursive procedure which basically will get you a conditional plan or a line plan, depending on which actions you choose. So if the G is satisfied in all states of B, then return whatever is the current plan. If not, you non-deterministically choose, that means search over, either non-deterministically choose a causative action A that is applicable in B, and then return, basically the plan is now added with whatever the previous plan plus action A. And then the belief state is progressed over this action to get the new belief state. Okay? But you can also non-deterministically select a sensing action. And when you do that, you have double recursion, basically because you will have to either go with, so that sensing action will either give P true or P false. Right? And so you change the belief state with P true in one branch and the P false in the other branch. And then call this recursive procedure twice. That's conditional plan. This is called conditional plan. And so a conditional planning, for a very simple example, where initial state, I don't know P, goal is to be in a state where G is true, and the actions I have are A1 says if P is true, I'll give you R and not P, and A2 says if not P, I'll give you R and P. And A3 says, if I have R, I'll give you G. And you can look at this and say, and then there's a O5 action called observe P. And so what happens is the plan will look like this. You do O5. During the execution time, you know actually whether it said P is true or P is false. Based on that, you take the branch. True branch is up and false branch is bottom. And then you do those actions. And you have to construct this plan. And basically, this little procedure constructs that plan. It's just multiple recursions right now. So the thing that you would like to try to figure out in, that I'll make you read for the next class is essentially look at a little more detail about belief state management and an understanding of how belief state search works in terms of both for conformant and conditional planning. Okay, and then there's a whole entire thing about improving heuristics for this that, we may not have actual time, but I'll at least make you read these two pieces and discuss it when we come back. Okay, thank you.
Sounds like a skill issue. Skill gap, skill problem, I don't know, skill. You're trying to take notes, but running totally out of energy, and then my brain going.
Yeah, I'm really good. Near the last 30 minutes.
Sorry, I we need to have that.
That's weird. Why is it free for students? It should be free for students. It has to be free.
I like the last note. Whatever partial circle and stuff, other drugs from this machine, schizo drug, exhausted. Schizo drug policy. What if the schizo drug failed? Hope other big brain drug. That's my last year. But not schizo drug.
Send me an email.
Because you can get a read it. Yeah, I can make it.
You can have the candy. It's like basically the other candy. Have the candy.
I'm gonna watch you just by yourself.